It's 1965. Singapore is now truly independent. At the age of just 42, Lee Kuan Yew has become its first prime minister. With severed ties with its Malayan hinterland, Singaporeans are on their own for the first time. It's Lee's job to build the country. But its only natural resource is its people. Lee knows they are his priority. When Lee came into power, most Singaporeans were living in villages known as kampongs. Looking at present-day Singapore, it's hard to believe that in the years after the war, many of these were widely reported as some of the world's worst slums. In 1966, more than 500,000 Singaporeans were living in slum-like conditions. In order for Singapore to progress, Lee and his government introduced a world-renowned public housing scheme. Lee's objective was clear.
To give every family a stake in the country. In other words, that we should find a way to give them ownership of their own home, their own apartments. Then, if their sons have to go to war and fight, they are fighting for themselves.
But he would also make clear to everyone that this ownership would come with responsibility.
We never went for the iron rice bowl. Each person has his own porcelain rice bowl, and if you break it, it's your bad luck. And they look after it when it is their own and it's porcelain.
This give-and-take philosophy would form the foundation of the next 5 decades of growth. But if Singapore was going to play a role in the global economy, there was another challenge it would need to overcome. In the 1960s, there were countless languages and dialects being spoken. English had been the administrative language of the colonial British government, but it was not widely spoken by the population. In order to promote economic prosperity and to bridge the gap between the country's many ethnic groups, Lee and his government chose to continue using English, for them the obvious choice for the country's official language. The decision wasn't taken lightly by Singapore's Chinese-speaking population, and particularly by its Chinese newspapers. But it was an early example of the level of control that Lee felt was needed in order to unite the country on the road to success. Nowadays, Singapore's press works in partnership with the government, assisting in promoting its policies. Some disagree, but most believe that this is for the good of the country. For Lee, the argument was quite straightforward and easily justified. It arose from decades of potential instability and careful development.
One value which does not fit Singapore is the theory that the press is the fourth estate.
You're a newspaper. You have certain duties to perform, and one of them is to promote the government, the policies of the government, which is for the good of Singapore. You see, if you think it's no good for Singapore, you want another policy, you chaps can go and form a party.
As Singapore grew, the unions that Lee had helped during his early years in politics still maintained a grip in certain sectors of industry. In 1980, Singapore Airlines employees called for a work to rule. But Lee would never stand for any industrial action that would lead to disruption.
2 weeks. It will take many, many months to repair the damage. I gave them a choice. Continue this, and I will, by every means at my disposal, teach you and get the people of Singapore, help me teach you a lesson you won't forget. And I'm prepared to start all over again. Or stop it.
Singapore's ministers became some of the highest earners in the country. Their salaries have long come under scrutiny, but again, Lee Kuan Yew had good reason for rewarding his parliament for the work they do.
This is not administration doing a job. This is entrepreneurship on the political stage on a national scale. We changed the complexion of Singapore.
Over the years, the critics would come and go, people who were prepared to stand up and speak out, But again, in the interest of the country, Lee always had ways of dealing with them.
Whoever governs Singapore must have that iron in him, or give it up. This is not a game of cards. This is your life and mine. I've spent a whole lifetime building this. And as long as I'm in charge, nobody's going to knock it down.
With a solid foundation of policies now in place, Lee Kuan Yew would go on to lead Singapore for the next 3 decades. During that time, he would become a role model and an inspiration to all Singaporeans. During its relatively short history, Singapore has ridden a storm flooded with challenges. As a country, it hasn't just survived, it's prospered and become what many describe as one of Asia's tiger economies. Over the years, it has also earned itself a reputation for being remarkably free from corruption.
如果要钱，不要参政。你一旦给人家收买，就卖出去你的命运，你的政治命运就完了，你的前功尽去。
When Lee Kuan Yew decided on a life in politics years ago, he was renowned in political circles for being clean. As the newly elected Prime Minister in 1959, he made it mandatory for his entire cabinet to be dressed uniformly in white shirts and trousers. The idea was to symbolize austerity and integrity.
他一点贪污他都没有办法容忍的，腐败是绝对不允许的，不允许存在的。
Despite his personal wealth, Lee and his family always lived modestly. There were few signs of a wealthy lifestyle.
他那样的一个生活布置，跟他做一个总理、做一个资政，这中间相差太远了。
And his life was free from any kind of scandal too.
他从来不去乱来。我记得他去参加泰国了亚细安的总理会，他们都要轻松一下嘛，就叫几个女孩子给他。他说哪里这个我不是我要的，不能够。所以他是对这些私生活，他不让人家抓到他的把柄，一点都不行。
Lee would never spend an unnecessary dollar of public funds on himself. He always flew on scheduled flights, never chartered, and stayed in regular hotel rooms.
他要到雅加达，他说你跟我订个单房。我说你哪里可以做一个总理住在单房？不可以，他很省钱的。我跟你安排，我说。我跟旅馆的人说他是总理啊，给他一个 mini suite， 不过价钱还是单房的价。
This prudent philosophy is something which runs deep in the Lee family. Lee's wife and his brother Kim Yew were partners in a law firm. They were committed to operating very cautiously and for good reason.
Mrs. Lee is in fact stricter than Mr. Lee. If she is making any application to the government for the client, she will not use her initials on the letterhead because she doesn't want the government servants to see that this is a letter from her. She doesn't want to even give the civil servants a chance to play favoritism.
So if she takes favors, get business from people and do them favors, it will affect me. So she was very careful.
Because even without doing bad things, people say bad things about you. So we have to be careful.
For all Lee's qualities, some still found his views on issues such as equality somewhat controversial.
The human being is an unequal creature. This is a fact.
But Lee never had trouble justifying these views.
If I tell Singaporeans we are all equal, regardless of race, language, religion, culture, then they will say, look, I'm doing poorly. You are responsible. But I can show that from British times, certain groups have always done poorly in mathematics and in science. I am not God. I can't change you. But I can encourage you, give you extra teaching help to make you do, say, maybe 20% better. So as a result, there is a certain realistic assessment of their capabilities and their possible achievements.
And for anyone who thinks that life in Singapore is too controlled, he had this to say.
I say without the slightest remorse that we wouldn't be here, we would not have made the economic progress if we had not intervened on very personal matters. Who your neighbor is, how you live, the noise you make, how you spit or where you spit, or what language you use. Had we not done that and done it effectively, we would not be here today.
他一方面是用法来使得这个社会能够守法，同时呢，也教育一般的这些新加坡的市民，叫他们重视如何的做诚实的事情，如何的不要欺骗人，如何在伦理道德方面好像也相当的重视。
It is this strict ethos that has helped this tiny nation achieve one of the highest per capita incomes in the world. But Singapore's affluence and its reputation for a clean government may not have been possible without the sterling example set by its prime architect, Lee Kuan Yew. When Lee Kuan Yew resigned in 1990, he'd already made history as the world's longest-serving prime minister. He'd stay on in the cabinet as senior minister and then minister mentor. His achievements over a 5-decade-long career in politics has earned him international recognition. His ideas and ideologies have been praised, even adopted by leaders all over the world. US President Barack Obama called him a legendary leader who helped trigger the Asian economic miracle. And in 2010, he was featured on Time magazine's list of the 100 people who have most affected our world. In 2004, his son Lee Hsien Loong became Singapore's prime minister, steering the country into the 21st century. Singapore's miracle growth has continued, taking advantage of its strategic position on global trade routes. And this has made up for the shortcomings in its natural resources, one of the concerns which had caused Lee to look for a partnership with Malaysia so many years earlier. Over the years, the combination of visionary leadership and an industrious population have become unbeatable. Through all this, and despite his commitment to the country, Lee always found time to keep an eye on his own health too.
先生是不是每天都游泳？
每天都游泳。
没有停过吧？
有时没有办法了，如果太忙的时候。
怪不得你的身体那么好。
一定要有运动才可以。
有没有特别的养生之道？
不要吃太多，够睡觉，够运动。工作也需要有兴趣。
His obsession with cleanliness and health was always a key part of Lee's domestic policies. Policies which helped him and his government transform Singapore from a rural, developing country into the garden city-state known across the world today. In October 2010, after years of ill health, Lee's wife, Kuan Yew, died in her sleep. She had been a pillar of support, a soulmate and probably the only one suited to Lee.
He chose Kuan Yew, who became his wife, because she was of sufficient intellect to be a suitable partner for him.
And it is true that he doesn't suffer fools gladly. He cannot talk to people who are, so to speak, not up to his level.
Lee learned lessons along the way. Maybe the most significant was early in life through his experiences with the Japanese during World War II.
日本人教育我，权力是什么意义的？政权可以改变人民的思想、社会的行为。
But despite Lee's great success, he always harbored one regret. The one thing that haunted him to the end was Singapore's expulsion from the Federation of Malaysia.
不得已离开，很痛苦，辜负了很多人，号召他们，动员他们，他们相信我们的话，然后放下他们，不得已做的。
Over the last decade, Singapore has ridden the global economic storm. As many countries struggled to survive, some even collapsing, Singapore actually prospered. The solid foundations that Lee Kuan Yew spent a lifetime building were finally in place. Now it was time for creativity to take over. International sports events, music concerts, and high-end retailers chose Singapore as their base. It has now become one of the shopping, food, and entertainment capitals of Asia. In 2008, Singapore signed a contract with Sands Casino, and the iconic Marina Bay Sands soared above the skyline. With a new business district in development, Singapore continues to grow as one of the world's most important financial centers. What would Sir Stamford Raffles make of what was once his sleepy outpost? In 2011, Lee Kuan Yew finally took a step back from politics, but his place in the history books is secure. To many, Singapore's rise is nothing short of a miracle. But is it possible that the very nature of the man who charted its course made Singapore's success inevitable?
Even from my sick bed, even if you are going to lower me into the grave and I feel that something is going wrong, I'll get up.